Today we are going to explore one of the most fascinating aspects of the European Middle Ages, the tradition of warrior kings, monarchs who did not merely command their armies from a distance, but who wielded swords and mounted war horses, fighting side by side with their soldiers on the battlefields. Throughout this documentary, we will meet three emblematic figures who personified this ideal of martial royalty and understand how, over the centuries, this practice was gradually abandoned in the face of the transformations of war itself. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. In medieval Europe, the legitimacy of a king was not built solely in the stone halls of castles or in the solemn ceremonies of cathedrals. It was forged often in the heat of combat, in the clash of swords and the thunder of shattering shields. A monarch who desired the respect of his barons, the loyalty of his knights, and the obedience of his subjects needed to demonstrate, above all, that he was capable of leading not just with words, but by example. He was expected to mount his warhorse, don his armor, and march at the head of his men toward danger. This expectation was not merely symbolic. It had deep roots in feudal culture, in which the bond between lord and vassal was sealed by oaths of mutual protection. The king, as the supreme lord, owed his vassals a willingness to fight for them, just as they owed him military service. A monarch who refused to wield his sword ran the risk of being seen as weak, as unworthy of the throne he occupied. And in an era when conspiracies, rebellions, and dynastic disputes were frequent, the perception of weakness could be fatal. It is in this context that one of the most celebrated figures in all of medieval history emerges. Richard, the first of his name to occupy the throne of England, known to posterity by one of the most powerful epithets ever attributed to a sovereign. But before achieving the fame that would echo for centuries, Richard was only the third son of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most influential women of the entire Middle Ages. Born on September 8, 1157, at Beaumont Palace in Oxford, he was not at first the most likely heir to the English throne. His two older brothers, Henry the young king and Geoffrey, preceded him in the line of succession. History, however, reserved a different destiny for Richard. Henry the young king passed away in 1183, a victim of dysentery. 3 years later, in 1186, Geoffrey died in an accident during a medieval tournament. The premature death of both brothers placed Richard in a privileged position to inherit the crown. Raised largely in his mother's court in the region of Aquitaine, in southwestern France, Richard absorbed the refined culture of the Provençal troubadours, learning to compose poetry in French and Occitan, the languages he mastered fluently. There is, in fact, a debate among historians as to whether he ever spoke English with any proficiency, despite being the King of England. But Richard's education was not limited to arts and letters. From a very young age he was instructed in the arts of war, and by the age of 16, he was already commanding his own army, suppressing rebellions in the Poitou region against his father's authority. The capture of the castle of Taillebourg in 1179, considered until then impregnable, was an early demonstration of his military skills and his audacity on the battlefield. Those who witnessed his first campaigns already perceived in him a ferocity and determination that distinguished him from his brothers. The relationship between Richard and his father, Henry II, was marked by tensions and conflicts. Henry seemed reluctant to grant any of his sons resources that could be used against him, and mutual suspicions fueled an atmosphere of permanent distrust. Richard even allied himself with King Philip II of France against his own father in a revolt that culminated in the defeat and humiliation of Henry II. The old king passed away on July 6, 1189, bitter and betrayed, and Richard finally ascended the throne. His coronation took place at Westminster Abbey on September 3rd of that same year, in a ceremony that was recorded as one of the first for which a detailed account exists, describing the ritual and the names of those present. But Richard had not become king to administer England in times of peace. His mind and heart were turned toward the east, toward the Holy Land, toward Jerusalem. 2 years before his coronation, in 1187, Sultan Saladin had captured the Holy City, provoking a wave of indignation and religious fervor throughout Christian Europe. The Pope called for a new crusade, the Third, and Richard was one of the first to take up the cross, solemnly vowing that he would set out to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim hands. As soon as he was crowned, he dedicated himself with singular energy to gathering the resources necessary to equip a crusader army. He sold lands, ecclesiastical offices, titles, and privileges. Legend has it that he even said he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer willing to pay the price. It was a demonstration of how, for Richard, the crusade was not a secondary commitment. It was the raison d'être of his reign. In 1190, finally, Richard set out for the east at the head of a formidable fleet of 180 ships and 39 galleys, accompanied by a considerable army. Before reaching the Holy Land, however, he made stops that already revealed his impetuous and combative nature. In Sicily, he encountered hostility from the local inhabitants and took the city of Messina by storm on October 4, 1190. On the island of Cyprus, after the local ruler mistreated the survivors of a shipwreck from his fleet, Richard landed, defeated, and deposed the ruler Isaac Komnenos, conquering the entire island in a matter of weeks. It was in Cyprus, moreover, that he married Berengaria of Navarre on May 12, 1191. In one of the most curious episodes of his journey, for Berengaria would be the only queen consort of England who never set foot on English soil. When Richard finally arrived at the port city of Acre, on the coast of the former Kingdom of Jerusalem, on June 8, 1191, he found a difficult situation. The siege of the city had already dragged on since August 1189, initiated by the French nobleman Guy of Lusignan. The Crusaders, though determined, were weakened by disease, suffocating heat, and a scarcity of supplies. To make matters worse, they were themselves besieged by a powerful Muslim army led by Sultan Saladin, who had positioned himself in a semicircle to the east of the city, trying to break the Christian siege and relieve the garrison of Acre. It was a paradoxical situation in which the besiegers were simultaneously the besieged. Richard's arrival transformed the scenario. With the energy and determination that were characteristic of him, he immediately supervised the construction of siege engines and intensified the attacks on the city walls. 2 enormous catapults were positioned before the walls of Acre, receiving names that reflected the spirit of the time. One was christened God's Stone Thrower, and the other Bad Neighbor. Richard offered rewards in gold to every soldier who removed a stone from the enemy fortifications, and he himself participated in the demolition work, tearing out blocks of masonry while arrows whizzed around him. There are accounts that even when he fell ill, possibly afflicted by scurvy, he ordered his men to carry him on a stretcher to the front lines, from where he fired his crossbow at the enemy battlements. It was a visceral demonstration of the type of leadership expected of a medieval king: physical presence in combat, a willingness to share the risks of his soldiers, and a courage that bordered on recklessness. Richard's presence altered the dynamics of a siege that had already dragged on for nearly 2 years, in a bloody stalemate that seemed to have no end. In 5 weeks, Richard achieved what Guy of Lusignan had not accomplished in 20 months. Sappers, encouraged by the rewards offered by the king, undermined the foundations of the walls, opening breaches that allowed for decisive attacks. On July 12, 1191, the city finally surrendered, ending one of the longest and most grueling sieges in the entire history of the Crusades. The fall of Acre, however, was followed by a dark episode that stained Richard's reputation. When negotiations for the fulfillment of the surrender terms dragged on, and Saladin appeared to use the prisoners as an instrument of delay, Richard ordered the execution of approximately 2,500 to 3,000 Muslim prisoners before Saladin's army. It was an act of brutality that shocked even some of his allies and provoked an immediate response from Saladin, who ordered that no crusader be taken prisoner from then on. War in the medieval Middle East knew no half measures, and both sides were capable of cruelties that defy modern sensibilities. But the massacre of the prisoners of Acre remained a stain on the reputation of the king, whom posterity would name the Lionheart. After the conquest of Acre, Richard turned his attention to the port city of Jaffa, whose capture was essential before any attempt to march on Jerusalem. To reach it, the Crusader army would need to travel about 130 kilometers along the coast under constant harassment from Saladin's forces. Richard demonstrated remarkable tactical discipline, organizing his army in a defensive formation during the march, with the infantry protecting the heavy cavalry and the Crusader fleet following by sea. For 17 days, Saladin's horse archers fired waves of arrows at the column, trying to provoke a hasty charge. Richard, however, kept his knights in formation, refusing to allow frustration to compromise discipline, balancing the need for cohesion with the impetus of his knights, who longed to face the enemy in open combat. The decisive moment came on September 7, 1191, when the Crusader army emerged from the forest of Arsuf and began to cross the coastal plain north of the city. Saladin, realizing that this was one of the last opportunities to engage the Crusaders on open ground before they reached Jaffa, committed his entire army to a massive attack. Modern estimates suggest that Saladin's forces totaled about 25,000 men, almost all cavalry, while the Crusader army numbered approximately 10,000 to 20,000 soldiers. The attack was launched against the center and rear of the Crusader column, with Egyptian cavalry charging against the Hospitallers who formed the rearguard. The pressure on the rearguard became unbearable. The Hospitaller crossbowmen were forced to load and fire their weapons while walking backward, a task that inevitably compromised the cohesion of the formation. The horses of the Christian knights fell under enemy arrows, and some dismounted knights were forced to join the infantry. Richard rode the length of the column, checking positions and ensuring that his orders were maintained. He awaited the ideal moment to launch a concentrated counterattack that could shatter Saladin's forces all at once. But discipline, even under the leadership of such a charismatic commander, has its limits. The Hospitallers, unable to endure the overwhelming pressure on their position any longer, broke formation and launched a charge on their own against the right wing of Saladin's army. Richard, faced with a fait accompli, reacted with the speed and adaptability that defined his military genius. Instead of trying to restrain the disordered charge, he ordered a general counterattack, committing his entire cavalry to a devastating assault. The Crusader knights, mounted on their heavy war horses and armed with lances, swept across the battlefield, dispersing Saladin's forces in a disordered flight. Richard, however, demonstrated a prudence that many medieval commanders did not possess. He restrained his knights before the pursuit became disorganized and vulnerable to an ambush, regrouping his forces to consolidate the victory. The Battle of Arsuf was an important victory for the Crusaders, though it was not decisive in a strategic sense. Saladin's army, despite suffering heavy casualties estimated at about 7,000 men, managed to withdraw and regroup. Saladin would never again challenge Richard in open battle, preferring to resort to guerrilla tactics and harassment. The victory, however, had a profound moral impact. It shook Saladin's reputation as an invincible commander and consolidated Richard's fame as the greatest warrior of his time. Contemporary Muslim chroniclers recorded tributes to the English king's courage and martial skill, recognizing in him a formidable adversary. After Arsuf, Richard captured Jaffa and established his headquarters there. Months of negotiations and skirmishes followed, during which Richard tried to advance on Jerusalem, but found himself hindered by a lack of resources and the impossibility of maintaining a garrison in the Holy City if he were to conquer it. Twice his army marched toward Jerusalem, and twice it was forced to retreat. It was a frustrating situation for a warrior of his caliber, and Richard knew that without the unified support of the other Crusader leaders, the reconquest of Jerusalem would remain an unattainable dream. In 1192, after defending Jaffa in one last spectacular battle, in which he once again demonstrated his personal courage fighting on the front line, Richard negotiated a treaty with Saladin that guaranteed Christian pilgrims safe access to Jerusalem, although the city remained under Muslim control. It was the best possible agreement under the circumstances, but it left a bitter taste for a king who had dedicated years of his life and vast resources to the Crusader cause. Richard's return to Europe was as dramatic as his crusade. Attempting to cross hostile territories after a shipwreck in the Adriatic, he was recognized and captured in the domains of Duke Leopold V of Austria, whom he had humiliated at Acre. Handed over to Emperor Henry VI, Richard was only released in 1194 after the payment of an astronomical ransom of 150,000 marks of silver, which cost England a quarter of every man's income for an entire year. Richard's final years were dedicated to defending his territories in France against the ambitions of Philip II. He built the imposing Château Gaillard, a fortress that demonstrated his mastery of military engineering, and waged incessant campaigns to protect the Angevin Empire. In 1199, however, while besieging the castle of Chalus in the Duchy of Aquitaine, Richard was struck in the left shoulder by a crossbow bolt. The wound became infected, and the warrior king passed away on April 6, 1199, at the age of 41. He died as he had lived, in combat, before the walls of an enemy fortress. It was a fitting end for a man who had personified, as few others had, the ideal of the medieval warrior king. The story of Richard the Lionheart vividly illustrates the expectation that medieval society placed upon its monarchs. A king was to be, first and foremost, a military leader. His presence on the battlefield was not just desirable, it was considered essential for the maintenance of his authority and his legitimacy. Richard understood this as few others did and made his martial skill the foundation of his reign. But he was not the only one to tread this path. Other figures in medieval history demonstrated, each in their own way, that the bond between royalty and the battlefield was one of the cornerstones of the feudal order. A few decades after Richard's death, Europe would be the stage for another conflict that would test the courage and skill of the military leaders of its time. And among these leaders, a young prince would emerge as one of the most celebrated warriors of the entire Middle Ages, achieving a reputation that would rival that of the Lionheart himself. His name was Edward of Woodstock, and history would know him by a dark and evocative epithet that would only be attributed to him after his death: the Black Prince. Edward was born on June 15, 1330, the eldest son of King Edward III of England. From a very young age, he was prepared for the role expected of him as heir to the throne. In 1337, at the age of 7, he was made Duke of Cornwall, the first duchy created in England. In 1343, he was invested as Prince of Wales, a title that consolidated his position as the future king. In 1346, at the age of 16, he was knighted by his father during the military campaign in Normandy, in the locality of La Hougue. It was a gesture loaded with symbolism. The young prince was being formally initiated into the order of chivalry, with all the obligations and expectations that implied. And it would not be long before those expectations were put to the test in the most dramatic way possible. The context was the 100 Years' War, the long conflict between the crowns of England and France that would stretch from 1337 to 1453. Edward III of England claimed the French throne through his mother, the daughter of King Philip IV of France. When Charles IV died without direct heirs in 1328, the French barons crowned Philip VI of the House of Valois, and the dispute degenerated into open war when Philip confiscated English territories in France. In the summer of 1346, Edward III landed in Normandy with an army that included knights, men-at-arms, and a large contingent of archers equipped with the English longbow. The campaign devastated northern France, approached Paris, and then headed north. When he learned that Flemish allies had retreated, Edward decided to face the French army that was pursuing him. He chose a defensive position near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu, on a slope that offered tactical advantages, with protected flanks and pits dug to disorganize the attacking cavalry. It was in this position on August 26, 1346, that one of the most decisive battles of the entire 100 Years' War was fought. The young Prince Edward, at only 16 years old, was given command of the right flank of the English army, also called the Vanguard, alongside Thomas Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, and John de Vere, Earl of Oxford. According to some sources, his contingent included about 800 men-at-arms, 2,000 archers, and 1,000 Welsh infantry soldiers. It was an immense responsibility for a teenager, but Edward III was determined to give his son the opportunity to prove his worth in combat. The French army, commanded by King Philip VI, was considerably larger than the English. The French relied on heavy cavalry, composed of armoured knights, as well as mercenary Genoese crossbowmen. French confidence rested on numerical superiority and the power of a heavy cavalry charge. In the late afternoon, the French advanced. The Genoese crossbowmen, hampered by bowstrings dampened by rain and deprived of their large shields, were decimated by the English archers and retreated in disorder. The French knights, impatient, rode over their own crossbowmen, adding confusion to confusion. What followed was a sequence of desperate charges against the English position, each facing torrents of arrows that brought down horses and knights in an unprecedented carnage. It was during this chaos that the young Prince Edward faced the most critical moment of his life. When the French front line, led by the Count of Alençon, concentrated its charge against the English right flank, the prince's position came under extreme pressure. The hand-to-hand fighting was intense, and for a moment it seemed the flank might give way. The commanders fighting alongside Edward sent an urgent messenger to Edward III, pleading for reinforcements. The king's response became legendary. When he was informed that his son was not wounded, Edward III refused to send help, declaring that he wished for the young prince to have the opportunity to win his spurs, an expression that meant proving his worth as a knight. It was a decision that combined strategic coldness with a calculated gamble on his son's ability. The young Edward did not disappoint. Personally involved in the fighting, he held his position, leading his men with a composure that impressed even the most experienced veterans. By the end of the day, when darkness and exhaustion finally put an end to the slaughter, the French army had suffered a devastating defeat. Estimates of French casualties vary, but the numbers are unanimously staggering. Thousands of French knights and men-at-arms lay on the battlefield, including high-ranking nobles and even kings allied with Philip VI. The young Prince Edward emerged from Crécy with a reputation that would spread throughout Europe. Edward III, according to tradition, refused to allow his son to kneel to thank him, declaring that the prince had earned the right to stand beside his king. The Battle of Crécy was a turning point in European military history. It demonstrated, in a devastating way, that heavy cavalry, for centuries considered the supreme force on the battlefield, could be defeated by a combination of disciplined infantry, clever tactical positioning, and the lethal power of the English longbow. The French would learn this lesson in the most painful way possible, and the young prince who had led the right flank on that bloody afternoon would emerge as one of the most feared commanders of his generation. 10 years passed after Crécy, during which Europe was devastated not only by war, but by the demographic catastrophe of the Black Death, which decimated approximately 1/3 of the continent's population. When hostilities were resumed in the mid-1350s, the Black Prince, now a mature man and an experienced commander, led his own campaigns in southern France. In 1355, he was appointed his father's lieutenant in Gascony and received orders to conduct a chevauchée through Aquitaine, a military raid that devastated the cities of Avignonnet, Castelnaudary, Carcassonne, and Narbonne. The following year, in 1356, he set out for another chevauchée, this time crossing the regions of Auvergne, Limousin, and Berry. It was during this campaign that fate led him to one of the most dramatic confrontations of the entire 100 Years' War. King John II of France, determined to intercept and destroy the Black Prince's force, gathered a significantly larger army and marched to face him. Estimates suggest that the French army numbered between 11,000 and 14,000 men, while the English prince's forces were considerably smaller. The peace negotiations that preceded the battle failed. Edward, aware of his numerical inferiority, offered to return captured territories and hand over the loot in exchange for a safe retreat, but King John, confident in his superiority, rejected the offer. On September 19, 1356, the two armies faced each other on the outskirts of Poitiers, in a rugged terrain of vineyards, woods, and marshes. Edward positioned his forces on a slope protected by natural obstacles, with a thick hedge in front and archers on the flanks. The French, trying to avoid the mistakes of Crécy, dismounted much of their cavalry, but heavily armoured men, forced to advance through rough terrain under constant arrow fire, lost cohesion and reached the enemy lines already exhausted. The battle unfolded as a brutal test of patience and discipline. The French attacked in successive waves, each facing the same devastating fire from the English archers. Edward commanded the centre of his army, holding his reserves until the decisive moment. When French resistance began to falter, he ordered a general attack, sending his reserve cavalry to strike the flank and rear of the French army. The maneuver was devastating. The French lines collapsed under the impact, and what followed was a carnage in which many English archers, with their arrow supplies exhausted, fought hand-to-hand with knives and daggers. The outcome of the battle was extraordinary. King John II of France, surrounded by English troops and with no possibility of escape, fought bravely but was finally forced to surrender. Capturing a monarch on the battlefield was an almost inconceivable achievement, and the news sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Edward treated his royal prisoner with exaggerated courtesy, a demonstration of chivalry that reinforced his reputation as the perfect knight, fearless in combat and generous in victory. The capture of John II forced France into negotiations that resulted in the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, by which vast French territories were ceded to England and a colossal ransom of 3 million gold crowns was established for the king's release. The Black Prince returned to England as the greatest warrior of his age, celebrated as a hero whose exploits rivaled those of the knights of the Chanson de Geste. His trajectory from Crécy to Poitiers embodied the ideal of the medieval aristocratic combatant, a leader who not only commanded his armies, but who personally exposed himself to the dangers of the battlefield, who fought with his men, and who achieved his glory through his own valor. Although he never became king, passing away prematurely on June 8, 1376, at the age of 45, a victim of a debilitating disease he had contracted during his campaigns in Spain, the Black Prince left a legacy that shaped the image of medieval chivalry in the popular imagination. But medieval history still held another crucial chapter in the saga of the warrior kings, a chapter that would mark simultaneously the zenith and the twilight of this tradition. And the setting for this final act would be not the distant sands of the Holy Land, nor the vineyard fields of France, but the rolling green heart of England itself. In the second half of the 15th century, England was torn apart by a dynastic conflict that would become known as the Wars of the Roses, a struggle for the throne between two branches of the royal house of Plantagenet, the House of York, symbolized by the white rose, and the House of Lancaster, represented by the red rose. The conflict had its roots in the consequences of the deposition of King Richard II in 1399, and intensified over the following decades as both factions disputed power with increasing ferocity. Nobles were executed, aristocratic families were decimated, and alliances were made and broken with disconcerting speed. The English nobility paid a terrible price for these decades of civil war, and the throne changed hands several times amidst bloody battles, conspiracies, and betrayals. In 1483, King Edward IV of the House of York passed away, leaving his 12-year-old son, Edward, Prince of Wales, as heir. The boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed protector of the realm during the young king's minority. What happened next remains shrouded in controversy and mystery. In June 1483, the Duke of Gloucester took the throne as Richard III after the young Edward V was declared illegitimate, probably at Richard's own instigation. The young prince and his younger brother were imprisoned in the Tower of London, from where they disappeared under circumstances that have never been fully clarified. The blame for their disappearance and probable murder is traditionally attributed to Richard III, although historians continue to debate the issue. From across the English Channel, a pretender to the throne observed the events closely. His name was Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, a descendant of the diminished House of Lancaster. Henry represented the last Lancastrian hope, and the difficulties faced by Richard III offered him an opportunity he could not waste. In 1483, Henry attempted a first invasion of England, but was thwarted by a storm. 2 years later, he was ready to try again. On August 7, 1485, Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven in southwest Wales with a force of approximately 2,000 French mercenaries. It was a small army, insufficient to face the royal forces in a pitched battle, but Henry counted on two factors in his favor: his Welsh ancestry, which guaranteed him support among the nobles and knights of Wales, and the growing unpopularity of Richard III among sectors of the English nobility. As he marched through the Welsh interior toward England, his army grew. The Welsh Baron Rhys ap Thomas brought 800 men. William ap Gruffudd contributed 500 from North Wales, and Gilbert Talbot added another 500 soldiers. By the time Henry crossed the border into England, his army numbered about 5,000 men. Richard III, alerted to Henry's landing, was in Nottingham, from where he moved to Leicester to gather his forces. The royal army was considerably larger, estimated at about 8,000 to 10,000 men, and Richard had the advantage of being the crowned king, commanding the resources and institutional loyalty of the crown. There was, however, an element of uncertainty hanging over the entire situation. The Stanley brothers. Thomas, Lord Stanley, and Sir William Stanley commanded a substantial private force of about 6,000 men, but their loyalty was ambiguous. Lord Stanley was Henry Tudor's stepfather, married to Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother, which created a family link to the pretender. At the same time, Richard III held Lord Stanley's son hostage, a brutal guarantee against betrayal. On the morning of August 22, 1485, the two armies met in the fields south of the town of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. Richard III had occupied a high position on Ambion Hill, from where he could observe both Henry's army and the Stanley forces, who remained apart on an adjacent hill, waiting to decide which side to support. It was a tense and unpredictable situation. The outcome of the battle would depend not only on the strength of arms, but on the political decisions made by men who carefully weighed the risks before committing. The battle began with an advance by Henry's army, commanded by the Earl of Oxford, an experienced veteran. The forces clashed in fierce combat, and for some time the outcome remained uncertain. The Stanleys had not yet moved, and their inaction increased the anxiety on both sides. Richard III, observing the battle from the height of his position, then made a decision that would define not only the outcome of that day, but the course of all English history. Spotting Henry Tudor with his personal guard in a relatively isolated position, Richard decided to launch a personal charge directly against his rival, seeking to decide the battle in a single bold stroke. It was a decision that perfectly embodied the spirit of the medieval warrior king. Instead of directing the battle from a safe position, Richard mounted his warhorse, wielded his lance, and rode directly toward the pretender to the throne. It was a moment of extraordinary audacity. The King of England, at the head of his personal guard, charged Henry Tudor with the intention of killing him with his own hands and ending the dispute for the throne once and for all. Richard's charge was fierce. According to accounts, he managed to strike down Henry's standard-bearer and kill several of his personal guards, coming dangerously close to the pretender himself. Henry and his men resisted, but the situation was desperate. It was at this critical moment that the Stanleys finally made their decision. Sir William Stanley launched his men into the fight, but not in support of Richard. He intervened in favor of Henry Tudor. The Stanleys' intervention was decisive. Richard's forces, already engaged in the charge against Henry, were hit in the flank by the Stanleys' cavalry. The king was surrounded, unhorsed, and killed in combat, fighting until the very last moment. Richard III became the last English monarch to die in battle. According to tradition, the royal crown, which he had worn during the combat, was found in a bush after the fight and placed on Henry Tudor's head by Lord Stanley. Henry was acclaimed king right there on the battlefield, becoming Henry VII, the first monarch of the Tudor dynasty. It was a scene that synthesized the entire tradition of the medieval warrior king: the throne won by the sword, legitimacy forged in blood, the crown transferred on the field where men had fought and died. Henry VII ascended the throne as the last English king to win his crown on a battlefield. His formal coronation took place on October 30th, 1485, and when he married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, in 1486, he finally united the two rival houses into a new dynasty, the Tudors. The Wars of the Roses were effectively over, although residual threats, such as the revolt of Lambert Simnel, still needed to be suppressed at the Battle of Stoke Field in 1487. The Battle of Bosworth Field ended not only the Wars of the Roses but also an era. Historians consider this confrontation one of the defining moments of English history, as significant, according to some, as the Norman conquest of 1066. It marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty, which had ruled England since 1154, and inaugurated the reign of the Tudors, which would extend until the death of Queen Elizabeth I in 1603. But Bosworth also represented, in a way, the last gasp of a tradition that had been in decline for generations. The tradition of the king who personally led his armies on the front line. For as the 15th century progressed and gave way to the 16th, the very nature of war was transforming irreversibly. Gunpowder, which had arrived in Europe from China through trade routes and Mongol conquests, was gradually redesigning battlefields. The first cannons had appeared as early as the beginning of the 14th century, but over the decades they became larger, more powerful, and more precise. The fall of Constantinople in 1453, when the enormous cannons of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II demolished the city's legendary walls, was the most dramatic demonstration of the transformative power of artillery. Simultaneously, portable firearms such as the arquebus emerged, allowing a peasant with a few weeks of training to strike down a knight trained since childhood. Plate armor became obsolete, and armies began to rely on large contingents of infantry armed with pikes and firearms supported by artillery. This transformation had profound consequences for the role of kings in war. When battles were decided by cavalry charges and hand-to-hand combat, the king's presence on the front line was not only possible, but desirable. He could inspire his men by example, lead charges personally, and demonstrate the physical courage that legitimized his authority. But when battlefields became dominated by artillery and firearms, the commander's presence on the front line ceased to be a virtue and became an unacceptable risk. A cannonball or an arquebus projectile did not distinguish between a king and a common soldier, and the death of the monarch in combat could destabilize the entire kingdom. Gradually, kings and generals began to direct their battles from more rearward positions, coordinating the movements of increasingly large and complex armies from protected headquarters. Armies also grew exponentially. In the Middle Ages, 5,000 to 10,000 men constituted a substantial force. With the professionalization of war, armies began to number in the tens of thousands, requiring administrative and logistical skills that surpassed the personal courage of the commander. War became a science of engineers and artillerists, and the military leader evolved from a front-line warrior to a strategist of complex operations. The transition was not abrupt. During the 16th century and even beyond, some monarchs still ventured onto battlefields, though increasingly rarely on the front line itself. But the trend was clear and irreversible. Heavy cavalry, once the queen of the battlefields, gave way to infantry and artillery. Medieval castles with their high towers and vertical walls were replaced by star-shaped fortifications, with low, thick walls designed to resist the impact of artillery. And kings who for centuries had legitimized their power through demonstrations of physical courage in combat began to exercise their military authority in increasingly indirect ways. It is fascinating to observe how this transformation altered not only the practice of war, but the very conception of leadership. In the time of Richard the Lionheart, a king who refused to fight would be despised as a coward. In the time of Edward the Black Prince, the commander's personal presence in combat was seen as the highest expression of nobility and chivalry. In the time of Henry Tudor, Richard III's charge against his rival was both an act of bravery and of desperation, the final gesture of a tradition that was already starting to become anachronistic. And in the decades and centuries that followed, the idea of a monarch personally wielding his sword on the front line would be increasingly seen as recklessness, not virtue. Gunpowder did not just destroy walls and armor, it destroyed an ideal. The ideal of the warrior king, of the monarch who won his legitimacy through personal valor, demonstrated on the battlefield, was gradually replaced by a conception of sovereignty based on administration, diplomacy, and the control of increasingly vast economic and military resources. The kings who followed Henry VII ruled empires that their medieval predecessors would not have been able to imagine, but they did so in radically different ways. The sword gave way to the pen, armor yielded to the cabinet, and the battlefield was replaced by the council chamber as the true theater of royal power. And yet, the figures of Richard the Lionheart, Edward the Black Prince, and Henry Tudor continue to exert a profound fascination over the popular imagination. They represent an era when leadership was demonstrated in the most visceral and risky way possible, through the willingness to put one's own life on the line alongside the men one commanded. Their stories remind us that there was a time when the crown weighed not just on the head, but on the shoulders of a warrior who needed to win and defend it with the strength of his arm and the courage of his heart. This tradition of warrior kings, although extinguished by the inexorable march of technology and political transformations, left indelible marks on the culture, literature, and the very identity of European nations. The songs of the troubadours celebrating Richard's exploits in the sands of the East, the accounts of chroniclers describing young Edward's courage on the fields of Crécy, the ballads narrating Richard III's fall at Bosworth Field, all of this composes a narrative heritage that continues to resonate centuries later in the way we understand history, power, and leadership. The fields where these men fought are today tranquil landscapes, covered in grass and silence. The walls that resisted their sieges are in ruins, eroded by time and weather. The swords they wielded rest in museum display cases, relics of an era that is gone. But the stories remain, and as long as there are those who tell them and those who listen, the memory of these warrior kings will remain alive, as a testimony to a time when courage, honor, and destiny were decided on the edge of a sword. And if this journey through the battles and fields of the Middle Ages has awakened in you the same fascination we feel when narrating these stories, then your place is here, by our side, in this continuous exploration of the past. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming documentary narratives, leave your like as a sign that this type of content deserves to be made, and share in the comments which of these warrior kings impressed you the most, or which other historical figure you would like to see explored in a future documentary. Every subscription, every comment, and every like helps us continue to bring history alive to you. Until the next journey.